Hi, I'm the Pink Pastor, and today I'm going to talk to you about religious trauma. Well, before we get into that, I should let you know I post new videos every Friday. You can find me on Instagram at Pink Pastor. You can find me on Facebook at pinkpastor365. You can email me if you wish, pinkpastor365@gmail.com, or you can look at my website, pinkpastor.com. Also, I should say, if you want to help continue this sort of content, please like, comment, and subscribe. These are the things that help me understand which videos are connecting with the audience and help me then to figure out what to do more of and what to do less of. Today's video on religious trauma, I need to start by saying this is not a scientific poll or anything. It's simply a reflection on my experiences and some of what I have heard from others in the community. Whether that be the LGBTQIA community. So it could be somebody like myself who's transgender and gay. Well, I'm lesbian. It could be somebody who's gay, who's lesbian, who's bi, who's poly, who's basically anything but the stereotypical straight, heterosexual, white, cisgendered couple. The other caveat I want to start this with is I'm not calling out any one congregation, any one individual, a set of individuals. I really want to talk today about the institution and the damage that some of that, and really the damage that sometimes institutional preservation, which institutions are designed to preserve themselves, but to talk about what that institutional preservation has meant to some. And so all of that said, I also want to acknowledge that change starts with the individuals. So if you hear this today and you feel convicted, examine. And if you've been a support and a help, thank you. If you find that there are places you could have done a better job, I invite you to use this as an opportunity. If you're one of those who has been traumatized by religion, I will link below with an organization that works on questions of religious trauma and helps with some of the deconstruction and some of the healing of that. So I want to also acknowledge that there are some individuals in religion who have been very supportive of me and of others that I know in the LGBTQIA+ community. Unfortunately, this did not mean we didn't get traumatized by the balance and organization as a whole. That's sort of my caveats to this video, if you will. Having spoken to the fact that it's about the institution as a whole, there are individuals who are welcome. The fact that I make this statement first, though, is interesting, because I don't feel like I can just stand here and state my truth without giving some people a bit of an out. I don't feel like I can stand here and speak about organization and organized religion as a whole without helping some individuals to know that I don't see them as a part of the whole. Honestly, the sad truth of the matter is the fact that I have to give that out probably impedes some of my healing from the trauma value of what's happened. So I want to talk about my story, because story is really where I find that we see those meanings at play. Me coming out, when I did that, I knew that it could cost me my call. I knew that it could mean I couldn't serve the church that I was serving. That means that when I was discerning whether or not to come out, whether or not to transition to live my authentic reality, it was all filtered through this lens that says, you know, this is how I understand myself. This is how I make a living. This is how I know myself to be. This over here is where I've built my career. And so it threatened my livelihood. My ability to serve the church as a whole was challenged. There are congregations now that I cannot serve. They will not have me. Also understand, there is a book written on coming out to your congregation. This is such a big deal in the church world that there's a manual of the best ways, a book written. And I read that, and actually there were a couple of them, and I read through them to try and figure out what it was that I could do to help my congregation. All of that starts to build into the trauma question, because in fact all of that means I know I am not fully and openly welcome in all corners of this organization. And maybe not even in the organization that I was currently at that time serving. This is such a big deal that I did really careful planning. At first I had to figure out, does it have to happen? Against this, I'm a Christian, I'm a pastor, what are people going to think of me? What are people going to think of this transition? What are people going to think of me after I've transitioned? Not simply, am I male or am I female? Oh wait, I'm female, let me go live that. There's all these other layers, and each one is a little cut. And so sometimes it's like this death by 1,000 cuts, and that trauma is, well, first off, let me define trauma for myself. Trauma is when we exceed our ability to cope. So any one of these things I could have easily coped with. I am a very resilient person. I will figure it out. And yet, when you get enough of these little cuts, right? There are a few things that in Lutheranism we talk to our bishops before they happen. Because our bishops need to know what's going on with the congregation, in the congregation, for the congregation, and for us as pastors, so they can best help us. But the fact that this is such a big deal, I had to talk to my bishop. And then, with the bishop and his staff, and I'm thankful for that, we had to plan out what was the best course of action. How do I best come out to this congregation? And then when I finally did, they're like, well, take a leave of absence and give us some time, which I and the bishop both agreed was merely a prelude to goodbye. So instead of goodbye, and also I had to make sure that the bishop's office could be present. I chose my day to come out in part knowing that that was one of the days the bishop's office could be present. Again, I can't just do it. I couldn't just be myself. It's a little trauma. But the cumulative trauma of all of this, I have come to realize, has in fact very much damaged my relationship with my faith, with the institutions that I've served, with the institutions I've spent my life in. I did finally come out. I decided that, in fact, I had no choice. I had to come out. I had to live my authentic self, and as my authentic self, I had to live my reality. And so I came out, but that's not the end. Then there's a discussion. We're discussing whether or not I should be myself and also continue the work that I've been doing. Everybody loved the work I'd done prior to that. It wasn't about whether or not I was a good pastor. It wasn't about whether or not I helped the congregation to balance their budget. It wasn't about whether we'd built some new great ministry. It's about whether I, because of who I am, could serve in that space and time. Was me as a transgender person who had chosen to transition a sin? Was me living as a lesbian a sin? Mind you, I'm still living with the same woman that I have been for 30 years. The person who is my wife, the person who is mother to my children, the person who has seen me through thick and through thin. I'm not giving up my marriage. She didn't even choose to walk away. And that was the bishop's first question, right? Second. First was, are you gay? And second is, your wife going to stay with you? And the fact that my living my reality then can affect whether or not my wife wants to stay with me, and that can then affect whether or not I am able to serve, it's another cut. And mind you, I'm not calling anybody out, because like my bishop before I came out was great. His staff was awesome. Was my living as a lesbian a sin? We had a nursery school. Would me living my authentic reality and thus presenting to the children of our nursery school that there is the ability to live in your authentic reality, would that create confusion for the nursery school students? Would it be too challenging for their parents? Would me just living as myself be too challenging for them? Would it be too challenging for their children? And then there's the question of how many people would just generally be uncomfortable with me being around as myself? You can see this is challenging. And this isn't the end. Because you see, I didn't keep my call. Now, thankfully, the congregation tried to do what they could to take care of me as they said goodbye. They ultimately decided that I was not who they needed me to be their pastor, because I was transitioning. That's really the only thing that changed. So I didn't keep my call. Now what happened afterwards? I went out and I found a new congregation, right? Not as their pastor. I was simply sitting in a pew worshiping. And this congregation did bring me in and take me in. I've always sort of felt a little bit like that was because some of my theology students were there. That helps a lot. They knew who I was beforehand. They knew who I would be afterwards. The pastor really does like me and is supportive of me. And so I think others sort of felt like, okay, we have to take her in. And that felt good. And then came the moment when maybe I could do something for my community as the transgender community, and I need a space to do it in. And that's too challenging for the congregation. That might challenge the congregation that borrows space, and therefore, by challenging that, so even inclusion isn't always full inclusion. Now, I don't want to say all churches are this way, but I do want to point out two things. The two churches in this area that I have found that are most accepting within Lutheran circles, okay, and there are other accepting churches in this area, but within the Lutheran circles. One, started by a gay man for the LGBTQ community to have a place to go to be safe, to worship. The other, pastor has a transgender child. There are other members in the congregation who have since flocked to that place because they have transgendered children. And so only when you actually involve people who have already been part of the LGBTQ community is it okay to be there fully, 100%. And then, I think, for me, one of the other things in this whole trauma question, I've mentioned that the bishop's office wants to be helpful. In spite of having done this by the book, in spite of these people being my friend, in spite of knowing some of these people for upwards of 15 years, and they know my ministry from the beginning to the end, they know my story, they come from an oppressed community, and so they value trying to give oppressed voices a space. In spite of all of that, they're not able to find a space where I can serve because, in fact, it would be too challenging. And they are not in a position themselves, institutionally, they're not in a position themselves to challenge those norms that allow this to continue. And so I will spend the rest of my time, the rest of my career, should I go back to serving a congregation. And even if I don't, even if I'm just worshiping, I'll spend the rest of my career wondering if I go to a new space, am I totally welcome? Knowing that the answer in probably 90% of these places is no, not totally. I'm guessing that 65% of the places would rather I not be there. And another 25% of places, they're happy to have me worshiping with them, but there are limits on what I can do. And then there's that last bit of places that are served by people who, outside the church, came to know the LGBTQ community. And as they came to know the community, found that they needed a space too, and found that they should have a space, and figured out how to make their space work for it. So the levels of acceptance are varied, and that is a bit traumatic at times. Now, this is my experience, but it's not unique. And I know it's not unique because there are organizations that cater to people with religious trauma. There are books written on coming out as a pastor. There are books written about coming out and as a member of a congregation. There are books written about being Christian and gay, lesbian, or trans. It's a whole part of this own theology question these days. In this area, we started a luncheon for LGBTQ pastors. Pastors who aren't like the other pastors. Yeah, that hurts a little. There's a support group online, which I'm incredibly grateful for. And if you need a place as a pastor or a seminarian to go to have these conversations as a transgender person, let me know. And if you're lesbian or gay or bi and need a place to go with these conversations, let me know. And I will try to hook you up with the appropriate people. Because we do need this help. We do have gifts to offer. And yet, I still fear that it may not be within my lifetime that I can openly serve in any congregation equal. I bring the whole enchilada unraveled, right? I'm a woman. There are congregations that won't have a woman. There are congregations who won't have a gay person in the pulpit. There are congregations, more yet congregations, who won't have a trans person in the pulpit. Because these things violate their understanding of faith. Mostly it makes me sad. Partly it makes me angry. But the reality is that all of this has added to trauma. The reality is that this altogether has exceeded my ability to cope with it on my own. And I must go and help find other people to help me through it. So I hope by hearing this video, maybe I moved your heart in a positive direction. Maybe I helped you understand you're not alone. Maybe I can help connect you to the things that might help start healing that trauma. So I thank you for watching this video, and I hope you'll come back on other days for other topics.